When an avoidant first begins to sense that the anxious partner is no longer giving them the same attention, energy, or pursuit, something subtle but powerful happens beneath the surface. For a long time, they may have felt secure in knowing that no matter how distant they acted or how many walls they put up, the anxious partner would always return, always reach out, and always fight to restore the connection. But when that pattern breaks and silence takes the place of pursuit, the avoidant suddenly feels the ground shift beneath their feet. They notice the loss of control, because what gave them security was not necessarily love or deep connection, but the predictability of being desired and chased. That certainty provided them with a sense of power, and now that it has disappeared, they are confronted with an uncomfortable awareness that their behavior may no longer be dictating the dynamic in the way it once did. The loss of control often stirs a quiet panic, though avoidants may not openly display it. They may continue to wear their mask of indifference, pretending not to care, but inside there is a storm of questioning that begins to rise. Why has the anxious partner gone silent now after so many attempts before? Why is there no message, no effort, no tug at their wall? This disruption in the familiar cycle forces the avoidant to notice that they are no longer in command of the tempo of the relationship. Even if they never wanted too much closeness, the fact that the anxious partner was always predictable gave them reassurance. Without that constant reassurance, their mind starts to wrestle with the possibility that they may have overestimated how much control they really had. That questioning does not stop at wondering where the attention has gone. It begins to seep deeper into their sense of self. An avoidant often builds part of their identity on the belief that they are the one who holds back, who cannot be tied down, who remains unshaken by someone else's absence. Yet when they are suddenly not pursued, they feel cracks in that self-image, because the silence of the anxious is a mirror that reflects something they cannot ignore. If you do not need them the way they assumed, then maybe they are not as powerful as they believed. That doubt is unsettling because it challenges their narrative that they can push someone away without consequence. The shift forces them to face the reality that even someone they once saw as clingy or overly attached has the power to withdraw, and that realization can be bruising to their sense of control. What makes this change even more powerful is that it is often unexpected. An avoidant is not used to the anxious partner simply disengaging, so the sudden loss feels abrupt and out of character. The avoidant may not consciously admit to themselves that they relied on that attention, but their reaction shows it. They may find themselves checking their phone, wondering if they missed a call or a message, or replaying in their mind the last interaction they had. That subtle anxiety is not something they would easily confess, but it is there, growing stronger as the silence stretches. And because they are not in the habit of naming or expressing these feelings, they are caught between the desire to maintain their distant persona and the nagging discomfort of losing the dynamic they once felt in control of. This is why the first change that happens when the anxious stops pursuing is the avoidant feeling the loss of control and beginning to question themselves. It is not just about missing a person, it is about losing the certainty of being the one who sets the terms of the relationship. That loss unsettles them because it exposes the truth that the anxious partner's attention was never guaranteed. And now they are left facing a silence that reminds them of how fragile the balance of control really was. When the anxious partner begins to ignore the avoidant, one of the most immediate and impactful shifts that takes place is the hit to the avoidant's ego. For so long, they may have relied on the idea that the anxious person would always return, always cling, always fight to regain closeness no matter how far they pushed them away. That belief fuels a sense of superiority, a quiet confidence that they can distance themselves and still be wanted. But when that cycle suddenly stops and the anxious withdraws their energy, it rattles the avoidant's pride. Instead of feeling untouchable, they are confronted with the possibility that maybe they were wrong, maybe their grip on the situation was weaker than they imagined. And that stings in a way that is hard for them to process. This bruising of the ego doesn't always come with dramatic outbursts or visible signs of distress. Instead, it often manifests internally in the quiet voice that asks why they are no longer the center of someone's focus. They may wonder what changed, whether the anxious found someone else, or whether their absence simply doesn't carry the weight they assumed it did. Each of these questions feeds into a growing discomfort that their importance is being re-evaluated by the very person they once took for granted. The avoidant may try to rationalize it away, telling themselves they don't care, but that rationalization only works on the surface. Beneath it, there is a nagging sense of rejection, and rejection is something even the most self-protective avoidant cannot ignore. The hit to their ego also exposes the vulnerability they have worked so hard to hide. For someone with avoidant tendencies, maintaining the upper hand is about more than control. It is about protecting themselves from the pain of feeling unwanted. When the anxious partner disengages, it flips that dynamic, and suddenly the avoidant is in the position of questioning their own desirability. They may look back on past interactions, replaying moments when they pushed too hard or acted too indifferent, wondering if those choices are what caused the shift. Though they rarely admit to regret, the quiet sting of having someone remove their attention plants seeds of doubt that are difficult to silence. The ego, once inflated by certainty, now feels the deflation of reality. This change can lead to subtle behaviors that reveal the cracks in their confidence. They may start checking social media more often to see what the anxious partner is up to, searching for clues that they are still missed. They may test the waters with small, indirect gestures, like liking a post or sending a casual message, not because they want deep closeness, but because they want to prove to themselves that they still matter. These actions are fueled not by genuine connection, but by the need to restore their wounded pride. It becomes less about love and more about reassurance, less about intimacy and more about regaining the validation that once seemed guaranteed. The ego craves proof, and when that proof is missing, it drives the avoidant to behaviors they might have once dismissed as unnecessary. The deeper truth is that the anxious ignoring them creates a crack in the illusion that they could endlessly push away and still be pursued. That crack forces them to confront not only the fragility of the dynamic, but also their own dependency on being wanted. The hit to their ego is not just about someone walking away. It is about realizing that they may not be as immune to rejection as they thought. That realization lingers, gnawing at their pride, because even if they outwardly dismiss it, the absence of pursuit is a constant reminder that their power was never as secure as they believed. When the anxious partner pulls away and begins to ignore the avoidant, another striking change unfolds beneath the surface, and it is the growing awareness of what the anxious person's presence once gave them. For so long, the avoidant may have acted indifferent to the reassurances, the check-ins, the constant effort that came with being loved by someone who cared deeply. They might have dismissed it as clinginess or labeled it as too much, never fully appreciating that those small gestures created a cushion of comfort in their daily life. But once that attention is gone, they are left to face a silence that feels far heavier than they expected, a silence that highlights all the little things they overlooked. The anxious partner's presence provided a safety net, even if they never admitted it, and when it disappears, the avoidant finds themselves feeling the absence in ways they are not prepared to handle. At first, they may try to convince themselves it doesn't matter. They may lean into distractions, pouring their energy into work, hobbies, or casual interactions with others. Yet no matter how much they try to fill the space, there is something uniquely unsettling about the missing consistency. The good mornings, the supportive words, the small reminders that someone was thinking about them throughout the day. These were not just habits of the anxious partner, they were invisible threads of connection that wove into the avoidant's life. And now, with those threads cut, the avoidant feels a quiet emptiness that no distraction seems to cover. It is in that emptiness that the realization begins to take root, that what they once dismissed as overwhelming was actually the very thing that kept them grounded in the relationship. The absence of comfort also exposes the avoidant to emotions they usually suppress. For someone who thrives on distance, vulnerability often feels unsafe, and yet the loss of a steady, caring presence forces them into that vulnerable space whether they like it or not. They may notice themselves becoming more restless, more irritable, or more contemplative than usual, because without the soothing presence of someone who constantly gave, they are left alone with the parts of themselves they often avoid. This is not something they can easily acknowledge, but it is felt deeply because the anxious partner's role was not only about giving reassurance, but also about stabilizing the emotional atmosphere. Without that anchor, the avoidant experiences the discomfort of being left to manage everything on their own. And it exposes the reality that independence doesn't always feel as strong or empowering as they try to believe. As time goes on, the realization becomes more difficult to ignore. The avoidant may catch themselves remembering small details they once brushed off, the way the anxious partner checked if they had eaten, the way they encouraged them when they doubted themselves, the way they tried to close the emotional distance even when it felt one-sided. These memories don't surface with ease or acceptance. Instead, they come with a tinge of regret, a subtle awareness that they undervalued something meaningful. It is in these moments of reflection that the avoidant begins to grasp the weight of what has been lost, even if they are unwilling to voice it. The absence is no longer just quiet. It is a reminder of how much they took for granted and how dependent they actually were on the very comfort they claimed to resist. This recognition does not necessarily push them to act immediately, but it does shift their internal landscape. They are no longer operating from a place of complete detachment, because the loss of comfort creates a pull they cannot deny. The anxious partner's silence has forced them to confront the reality that what they once minimized was essential to their emotional balance, and that realization unsettles them more deeply than they would ever admit out loud. When the anxious partner withdraws and begins ignoring the avoidant, one of the quickest changes that emerges is a surge of curiosity that the avoidant cannot easily suppress. On the surface, they may try to maintain the appearance of calm detachment, convincing themselves that nothing has shifted, but internally the silence begins to gnaw at them. They start to wonder what the anxious partner is doing, who they might be spending time with, and why they are no longer reaching out as expected. This curiosity is not simply casual interest. It comes from the disruption of a pattern they had grown accustomed to, a pattern where they were always pursued, reassured, and validated without having to ask for it. Now, that pattern is broken, and the absence of effort from the anxious partner leaves a question mark that grows louder with every passing day. At first, this curiosity may appear in subtle ways, like scrolling through old conversations, replaying the last interaction, or even checking to see if the anxious partner has been online. These are not actions the avoidant would normally admit to, but the silence fuels a restlessness that makes them seek information. They want to know if they are being missed, if their absence is being noticed, and whether the anxious partner has truly shifted their focus elsewhere. What once felt like a sure thing now feels uncertain, and that uncertainty breeds a level of curiosity that borders on obsession. Even if they tell themselves they don't care, their actions betray a different story, because the need to know becomes a quiet fixation. As this curiosity deepens, the avoidant often finds themselves imagining scenarios that test their sense of importance. They may picture the anxious partner laughing with someone else, moving on without hesitation, or thriving in ways that don't involve them. And these images create an uncomfortable mix of emotions. On one hand, they may feel defensive and dismissive, trying to convince themselves that they don't need to be part of that life. On the other hand, the thought of being forgotten or replaced stirs an uneasiness they cannot shake. The curiosity transforms into a silent battle, a tug of war between their desire to appear unaffected and their need to know where they truly stand. This tension keeps them engaged in ways they never expected, because the lack of communication leaves too much space for the mind to wander. This curiosity often spills over into behaviors that betray their hidden interest. They may start quietly monitoring social media, paying closer attention to the anxious partner's activity, or asking mutual friends subtle questions to gather updates. These actions may be masked as casual or coincidental, but they reveal the truth that the avoidant is no longer indifferent. The anxious partner's silence has forced them into a position of watchfulness, where their curiosity becomes an active search for clues. This shift is significant because it highlights how the avoidant, who once thrived on creating distance, is now investing energy into closing the gap, even if only through observation. They may not reach out directly, but their heightened awareness shows that the absence has made them more attuned than they would like to admit. The deeper this curiosity runs, the more it challenges the avoidant's sense of control. They are used to dictating the pace, keeping the anxious partner in a state of pursuit, but now the roles have subtly reversed. The anxious has stepped back, and in response, the avoidant is leaning forward, even if it is only in their thoughts. This curiosity is not just about missing a person, it is about grappling with the uncomfortable realization that they are no longer the sole decider of how the connection unfolds. The unanswered questions keep their attention hooked, and each day of silence adds to the intensity of their curiosity, making it clear that the shift in dynamic has left an imprint that they cannot easily escape. When the anxious partner stops reaching out and begins ignoring the avoidant, one of the most revealing changes that follows is the way the avoidant often attempts to re-engage. At first, they may resist the urge, clinging tightly to their image of independence and control, but the silence soon becomes too loud to ignore. The avoidant, who once felt confident pushing the anxious away, suddenly finds themselves testing the waters to see if they can still draw them back. These attempts are rarely bold or straightforward. Instead, they are subtle, often disguised as casual gestures, because for the avoidant to openly admit they miss the attention would feel far too vulnerable. Yet the need to know if they still hold influence begins to outweigh their desire to remain detached, and so the re-engagement begins. These attempts can appear in many different forms, ranging from a sudden, seemingly random message to a quick reaction on social media, to a question that doesn't really need answering but serves as a way to spark communication. On the surface, these gestures may look like nothing, but beneath them lies a deeper motive, to confirm that the anxious partner is still within reach. The avoidant is not necessarily seeking intimacy or closeness in these moments. They are seeking reassurance that they still matter, that they are not as easily forgotten as the silence has made them fear. The re-engagement serves as a test, and if the anxious responds, the avoidant takes it as proof that the power they thought they lost is still in some way intact. The nature of these tests is often cautious, because avoidants are not comfortable exposing themselves too much. They may frame the message in a way that seems light-hearted or casual, as if it carries no weight, but behind it sits the unspoken question: will you still respond to me? This behavior reveals a lot about their internal struggle, because while they are drawn to test the connection, they are equally afraid of rejection. If the anxious partner does not respond or does not react the way they once did, the avoidant feels the sting even more sharply than before. That sting confirms what they were trying to avoid all along, that the dynamic has shifted and that they no longer have the same hold they once relied upon. Sometimes these re-engagement attempts can escalate if the first tests do not bring the desired reassurance. An avoidant who feels ignored for too long may grow bolder, showing up in more noticeable ways, either through more frequent contact or sudden expressions of interest that feel out of character compared to their usual distance. The silence acts as pressure, and the longer it goes on, the more the avoidant feels compelled to act against their natural instinct to withdraw. This is not because they have suddenly changed their style, but because the unfamiliar experience of being ignored forces them into behaviors they would normally avoid. Their need to restore balance and recover their sense of importance pushes them toward actions they once resisted. At the heart of these re-engagement efforts is the undeniable truth that the avoidant's confidence was built on the assumption that the anxious would always be there. When that assumption is broken, they are left with an uncomfortable void that compels them to act. Their attempts may not come across as grand gestures of love, but rather as small, careful steps to pull the anxious back into orbit. Each of these actions reveals more about their hidden dependency than they would ever admit. And it becomes clear that the moment the anxious stops feeding the cycle, the avoidant is left scrambling to see if they can reignite it, proving that their need for validation runs deeper than their walls of detachment would suggest.